Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
Weisberg was a quiet town. There was a market square of flower sellers and soup stands and tall warehouses fogging the streets. Thomas Hutter, one of the more affable citizens, was a man whose ambitions seemed to exceed the town's scale. He was young and full of dreams, which his employer, Mr. Knock, both appreciated and exploited. Thomas's wife, Ellen, was his counterbalance, as quiet as he was talkative, and as introspective as he was practical. Her dark eyes seemed to hold a depth that spoke of another world, and her beauty was a frequent subject of gossip in the town. That winter morning, Ellen awoke with a crash of thunder from a nightmare. After a moment, she realized she was awake and sweetly reached for the embrace of her husband. But he was gone. Thomas? Across their middle-class bedroom, Thomas was invested in his tie before the mirror. Their brand-new furniture obscured the age of the room, with peeling wallpaper and stains upon the ceiling. "What's that, my love?" He turned to her, finishing the knot. "What is it?" For a moment, Ellen considered telling him of her terrible dream. Then she wrapped her arms around him tight and said, "The honeymoon was far too short. Just 1 minute more," she cried, covering him in kisses. "How should I be worthy of such a doting wife?" he asked. Mr. Knock's office was cramped and disorderly, and smelled of ink and old parchment. Knock sat hunched at his desk like a goblin, his fingers twitching as he giggled like a simmering tea kettle. His eyes darted up as Thomas entered. "Our newest client," he said, producing a letter with a flourish and blowing on it to dry the ink. "A man of considerable means seeks to acquire property here, a large estate for him to retire in. And you, my dear Hutter, are going to make it happen." The prospect intrigued Thomas. "I'll be pleased to recommend some properties," he said. "I've already selected the Blackwood Manor," Mr. Knock stated, and Thomas was taken aback. "Forgive me, but is it not in ruins?" Mr. Knock's smile widened. "The Count seeks an old home and will pay generously. These nobles don't know what to do but spend. There's just one thing, though," his employer said, avoiding his gaze. "You'll need to journey to him in the Carpathians, a remote but remarkable country called Transylvania." Thomas hesitated, but the allure of securing the deal proved far too tempting. "It shall be a great adventure for me," he declared at last. "I'll leave at once." Thomas walked home in an anxious state, passing along the iron gates outside of the old Blackwood Manor. It was horribly decrepit, about to collapse. Really, who could want to live there? A sprinkling of lilacs grew on the property, strange so late in the season, and Thomas used his knife to cut a bouquet for his wife. At home, Ellen greeted the news and the flowers with silence. That evening, as the wind howled against their cottage walls, she clung to Thomas, her hands trembling. "Something dark awaits you there," she whispered. "I don't know why, but I feel it, Thomas. Please don't go." Thomas laughed softly. "Ellen, it is just business. I'll be home soon, and then we'll celebrate." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, his words warm but his mind already wandering to the adventure ahead. "Why have you killed such beautiful flowers?" Ellen suddenly asked. "What?" Thomas was perplexed. "What are you talking about? Let's put them in water." "They will only die in a few days," said Ellen. "Throw them out." "What?" "Throw them out!" Ellen's dreams that night were filled with shadows. It was their wedding, and the scent of lilacs was strong, and she was happy, so very happy. Yet, when she reached the altar, Thomas was not there. Instead, before her in all black, was Death himself. They exchanged vows, and when they turned around, everyone was dead. The stench of their bodies overwhelmed the flowers, but still, Ellen felt so happy, happier than she had ever felt, as she held hands with Death. The morning Thomas left was cloaked in a damp mist that clung to the cobblestones and veiled the surrounding hills. Ellen stood by the gate, and in his hands she placed a silver heart-shaped locket, and upon opening it, Hutter found a portrait of his wife on the left and a small lock of her shining black hair on the right. As he kissed her goodbye, he wondered if he shouldn't stay, and feared that her past melancholy had returned. He waved cheerfully as he climbed into the waiting carriage, promising again to write and return before long, and Ellen watched the carriage until it vanished into the fog. The scenery grew wilder with each passing hour, as farms gave way to forests, forming a canopy that swallowed the sky. The air grew colder, and even the horses grew skittish, tossing their heads and stamping erratically. "Count Orlok," whispered the innkeeper's wife, crossing herself. The other patrons of the inn fell silent, their faces pale. The dark tavern was thick with pipe smoke, and the patrons cut an exotic profile to Thomas in their sheepskins and homespun embroideries. "I'm traveling to his castle," Hutter replied cheerfully. "I shall present the deed to his new property in Weisburg." The innkeeper shook his head gravely. "No good'll come of this," he muttered. Thomas laughed nervously. "Come now, surely those are just old superstitions." The innkeeper's wife thrust a small cross into Thomas's hand. "For protection," she said urgently. "Beware his shadow." Hutter accepted the charm out of politeness, while internally he dismissed their fears as vintage hysteria. That night, he was disturbed by unfamiliar noises outside his window. Presumably the wailing winds catching against the branches of a tree, scratching, shuffling, and the little sleep he procured was quite poor. When he awoke, he found the crucifix the woman gave him around his neck, and ripped it off, throwing it to the floor in terror. He hadn't put it on himself. It was not until late the next evening that Hutter saw before him the jagged silhouette of the castle. The carriage driver, who had been silent for most of the trip, pulled the reins sharply. "This is as far as I go," he announced. Hutter frowned. "But the castle is still a mile away, at least." "You'll have to walk," the driver said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I'll not set foot any closer. They say the land itself is tainted." Frustrated but undeterred, Hutter climbed down and retrieved his bag. The driver snapped the reins and the carriage disappeared into the forest, leaving him alone in the clearing. As he approached, the full scale of the castle became apparent. Its massive gates were rusted and overgrown with thorny vines, and the stone walls bore the scars of centuries of decay. Yet there was an undeniable grandeur to it, a stark beauty that made Hutter pause in awe. He had seen paintings of noble estates in far-off lands, but this place felt of another world entirely. Before he could reach for them, the gates creaked open of their own accord, and he continued across the cracked cobblestones of the courtyard, empty other than the overgrowing moss. In the distance, Thomas could hardly make out the figure of a man in the dense fog, holding a flickering lamp. He was deathly pale with a bald head. As Hutter approached, the figure walked slowly, too tall, too thin, in all black. He stopped several paces away from Thomas, who dipped into a bow.
"You are late,"
the figure said, before turning and walking into the abyss, into the castle. Exhausted and stunned, Thomas followed. The great hall was dimly lit by a single chandelier, its candles flickering weakly against the vastness of the space. Tapestries hung on the walls, their colors faded and their patterns indistinct. Orlok led Hutter to a small dining table set with a meager meal, black bread, cheese, and a goblet of dark wine. "Please forgive my tardiness, Count." Hutter forced a smile and extended his hand. Orlok took it, his grip surprisingly strong and cold as ice. "Thank you for hosting me. It's an honor to assist you with your business." Orlok's lips curled into a faint smile.
"The honor is mine. Now, please, eat,"
the Count said, watching Hutter with an unsettling intensity.
"You must be weary from your journey."
Hutter sat and ate sparingly, aware of Orlok's unblinking gaze.
"You have the deed?"
Thomas nearly choked on the bread. "Would you not wish to wait till morning?"
"I am most impatient to bring my eyes to your papers, and I hold matters I must attend to tomorrow."
"Yes, of course, my lord." The Count took the papers, and Thomas noted the few long hairs resembling cobwebs that dangled from his shoulders. His rich clothing was worm-eaten and filthy. Thomas didn't see the mummy-like hand crawling up the ancient decanter like a spider, before the Count filled Thomas's cup and said,
"Drink."
By the time Thomas turned his cup, the Count had vanished. Somehow, he now sat in a throne across the room, examining the documents. Hutter could think only of sleep, but unsure of what to do, he began to slice himself some bread.
"You are married, yes?"
The question startled Thomas, and flinching, he cut himself. The Count's eyes shifted to the blood, his breathing growing louder.
"I might ease your wound."
"It's nothing," Thomas replied, guarding the injury. But Orlok slowly grew nearer and nearer, his bestial breathing growing louder. Thomas was motionless, shaking with fear as his blood dripped to the floor below. Then, the Count led him to the enormous fireplace, where he fell into a chair. He was in and out of consciousness. In the darkness, Orlok approached him, bringing up his arms, and as Thomas tried to scream, the Count lunged with the speed of a terrible beast, and all was black. Hutter woke the next morning to the pale gray light filtering through the heavy drapes. He was on his stomach on the cold stone floor. As he rose to his feet, he found that his collar was undone, and his shirt somewhat open. There were flecks of red on his tie. With his first step, he felt a sharp pain in his chest, and when he made his way to the great hall, Count Orlok was already waiting.
"I trust you slept well, Mr. Hutter?"
he asked. "As well as can be expected," Hutter replied, his tone polite but strained. Orlok held the signed document out for Thomas to see.
"Now, we are neighbors,"
he said. After a cough, Thomas thanked the Count and congratulated him on his new home.
"Is that a maiden's token I see?"
Orlok's eyes were on the silver locket, which was peeking out from Thomas's waistcoat. "Oh, yes." Orlok extended his skeletal fingers for the locket.
"May I?"
Thomas felt the request to be odd, very odd. But the Count kept his hand erect. "Of course," Thomas managed, removing the necklace and handing it to Orlok. Breathing heavily, the Count opened the locket to reveal the portrait of Ellen and her lock of hair, and instantly, he was transfixed. "We are newly married as of late," Thomas muttered as Orlok smelled the locket.
"Lilac," he said to himself. "You are fortunate in your love."
With that, Orlok was nowhere to be found, and the locket was on the floor. Thomas had never felt more vulnerable, swallowing a lump as he reached for the totem. And though he did not see it for himself, only the portrait remained inside. That evening, Hutter dined alone. Orlok had excused himself, claiming urgent matters to attend to. Left to his own devices, Hutter explored the castle further. The labyrinthine hallways led him to unfamiliar rooms filled with decaying furniture and cobwebs thick as curtains. He came upon a locked door, its wood scarred with deep gouges as though something had tried to claw its way through. He pressed his ear to the door and quickly went stumbling back, his breath quick and shallow. He had heard a faint scratching noise from the other side. The next day, Hutter awoke to find himself alone once again. He ventured outside, and as he wandered, he stumbled upon a cellar door partially obscured by overgrown ivy. A strange compulsion drove him to open it. The cellar was heavy with the scent of decay. He had found the castle's catacombs. Rows of coffins lined the walls, their lids slightly ajar. Hutter's curiosity turned to horror as he saw lying within the largest one at the center, the body of Count Orlok, horribly mangled, naked and half-buried in the rat-infested earth. His leathery flesh was bloated and bruised, and his slightly open mouth revealed sharp, carnivorous teeth. His eyes were open wide, murky, and colorless. Hutter backed away, his heart pounding. He had to escape the castle, warn Weisberg, and protect Ellen. Black wolves chased him like phantoms back to the castle, growling and barking. Hutter slammed the door of his chamber as the beasts thrashed against it. Breathing heavily, he moved a massive oak wardrobe in front of the door. Fashioning a makeshift rope of torn sheets, Hutter climbed from his window to the ground, his hands raw and bleeding by the time he touched the soil. Then he ran into the forest and towards the nearest village. Back in Weisberg, Ellen was in bed when she heard a low voice faintly whispering. Feeling as if in a trance, she rose from the bed and crossed to the window, where she watched the ships in the harbor in her nightclothes. Then, a strange shadow seemed to pass across the moon, a leathery, mummy-like claw of a hand, and Ellen felt the shadow overwhelm her. Count Orlok's departure from the castle was marked only by the creaking of his coffin-laden carriage as it rolled across the forest path. Each coffin was filled with soil from the Count's homeland and carefully secured for the long journey to Weisburg. Orlok's coffins arrived at a small port where a schooner, the Demeter, awaited its mysterious cargo. The crates were to be stored in the hold and left undisturbed no matter what. By the time the ship neared Weisburg's harbor, only the weathered captain remained alive. Haggard and delirious, he tied himself to the wheel, determined to see the ship to shore. Ellen awoke from a terrible dream, one of rats swarming the streets, carrying the plague to every corner. As news of the ship's arrival reached her ears, a deadly chill ran through her. "He is coming," she whispered. Thomas was alive, but barely. He awoke in a strange bed, shirtless and sweating profusely. He wore a wreath of garlic, and crosses had been drawn all over his pale skin. There were nuns all around him, the same ones who had found him practically dead in the snow, and the same ones who discovered the horrible bite marks upon his chest. They shouted prayers and doused him with holy water and swaddled him in blankets. Later, a young novice translated for the old woman who spoke to him in Romanian. "We are cursed to have such a creature in this land, a black magician in life who wished to conquer death. The devil himself preserved his soul so that his corpse would walk again, immortal." Thomas broke down into tears. "No, it was a dream. I must leave." "His evil infects your mind," the novice continued. "You are trapped in his shadow." The elderly Romanian woman bent forward and enunciated, "Nosferatu." Thomas looked at the novice, who whispered, "A vampire." The townspeople gathered at the docks, murmuring among themselves as they beheld the derelict ship that arrived in the night. A group of dock workers found the captain's lifeless, bloody body still lashed to the wheel, face contorted in terror, still holding a rosary in his ice-covered hands. Below deck, they found the splintered remains of a smashed crate and bits of foul dirt, but nothing else, and the missing crew was presumed to have fell out at sea. The rats that had stowed away in Orlok's coffins spread through the town like wildfire, bringing sickness and death in their wake. People fell ill by the dozens, and the town became a place of mourning, its streets lined with funerary carts, with white chalk crosses on all the doors, and the church bells ringing always. And slowly, from Blackwood Manor, Count Orlok's shadow spread over the city like a storm cloud in his shape, slowly moving, ever slowly, overtaking the city. Days later, Ellen burst from her bedroom, her eyes filled with hope. "He is here!" she cried, running out to the street in her dressing gown, unaffected by the icy rain. Thomas had arrived on horseback, nearly horizontal, and upon seeing his blushing bride, he tumbled from the saddle dressed in religious garb. They embraced, and she picked him up from the street and kissed him all over his face. Inside, they sat together wet and shivering, and though Thomas thought that Ellen seemed herself again, he coughed and coughed and coughed. At last, he asked, delirious, "Is this a dream?" That night, As Ellen watched Thomas sleep beside her, she felt a deep ache in her heart to notice that he no longer wore the locket she gave him. At once, he began to struggle, sweating and convulsing. She gently touched him, but he pulled away, barking, "Get off of me! I cannot breathe!" She was stunned. Then he threw her off of him violently, striking her by accident so mightily that she fell from the bed. As Thomas looked at her rejected form, he thought that she was beginning to look haunted and strange again. When Ellen finally found sleep, she dreamed of Orlok again, his shadow slipping into her thoughts, binding her to him in a way that felt both dreadful and inescapable. When morning came, Thomas's mood had lifted, though his face bore the pale imprint of another restless night. Over breakfast, he confessed to a nightmare that had clawed its way through his sleep, a jagged recollection of his days in Transylvania. When he described the man he encountered there, supernaturally tall, impossibly thin, with skeletal features, her stomach turned. It was the same figure that haunted her dreams. Thomas knew he must say it aloud then, no matter how heavy or unreal, the words that made the house feel so suddenly fragile. Nosferatu. Vampire. Ellen sat by the window, her eyes tracing the slow, somber procession of coffins through the distorted waves of glass. Thomas entered the room in coat and hat and pressed a kiss to the crown of her head. "You will kill this creature?" she asked, her voice steady but soft. "Yes," Thomas replied. She turned to face him, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. "You promise you won't return to me until he's dead? You promise? Promise me." "I promise," he said, his voice unwavering. She caught his hand, her grip tightening. "He doesn't have power over you, Thomas. I know it." Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if reluctant to let go. But then he released her, and with a resolute step, he walked out the door. Ellen watched him disappear, her gaze lingering on the threshold long after he had gone. Turning back to the window, she pressed her fingers lightly against the cool glass. In the silence that followed, something deep within her stirred. A faint, undeniable certainty that her destiny was no longer her own. Slowly and deliberately, she unpinned her long black hair. It fell in dark waves around her shoulders, catching the dim light as she drew a breath, steadying herself. She crossed the room to the window, and with a swift motion flung it open. The night rushed in, swirling around her, tugging at her hair and the hem of her gown. She slowly raised her arms, as though casting a spell, and her voice, barely more than a whisper, slipped into the night. "I bid you, come to me." Miles away, in the shadowed halls of Blackwood Manor, Orlok froze mid-step. His head turned sharply, his ears attuned to the irresistible pull of Ellen's call. He had heard her. Her voice had reached him. Led by Thomas, the vampire hunters moved with grim urgency through the quiet streets of town. They ran across open fields, torches flickering, the pale moonlight guiding their way. Through the cemetery they raced, past leaning headstones and tangled weeds, and down the canal in a small, creaking boat. The mob burst through the gates of Blackwood Manor and pushed the chapel doors open. As a great flurry of wings erupted, pigeons, startled by the intrusion, taking to the air in chaotic bursts. Then they saw them. Rats, thousands of them, piled in writhing heaps. "Don't let them bite you," Thomas called out, his voice strained but commanding. He lowered his torch, the fire blazing against the oncoming tide of rats. "The fire will keep them at bay." The men followed his lead, lowering their torches as they pushed forward, though many rats still crawled over their boots and snatched at their legs and hands. They waded through the mass of squirming bodies, and suddenly their eyes fell on the crates, Orlok's supply of earth. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed the axe, his hands trembling as he raised it high. With each swing, wood splintered and cracked, the crates collapsing under his fury. The others joined him, prying apart the boxes and spilling their cursed contents onto the stone floor. "Set them ablaze," Thomas shouted. Torches lowered and flames leapt hungrily at the shattered remains and dark soil. "The fire's spreading," one of the men cried, but Thomas was undeterred. He saw the large stone coffin before him, unaffected by the flames, still covered properly like a ghastly centerpiece. He threw open the coffin lid, and without pausing, he shut his eyes and drove the spike down with all his might. "Thomas, stop!" one of the others cried, lunging toward the coffin. But it was too late. From the box came a gasping scream. An emaciated, pale arm shot out, fingers clawing at the air. Blood splattered across the dirt as the figure writhed, the stake buried deep in its gut. Thomas stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. It was not Count Orlok. It was Mr. Knock, old, frail, his body broken, his mouth spilling blood. His sunken eyes glinted with an eerie satisfaction as his voice rasped from the depths of his ruined chest.
"I relinquished him, my soul,"
Knock choked, his words drenched in agony, yet resolute. The flames roared higher behind them, the chapel filling with smoke and the stench of burning earth. Knock's trembling hands grasped at the stake buried in his body. With a grimace of pain, he pushed it deeper, his bony fingers sticky with blood.
"I should have been the Prince of Rats,"
Knock rasped.
"But he only cares for the pretty bride I promised."
As he spoke, his hand rose, trembling, and clutched in his blood-stained fingers was a heart-shaped silver locket, caked with dirt. "No!" Thomas gasped, his face twisted with anguish. A terrible realization gripped him, hollowing out his chest. Ellen was alone. He had left her at home, vulnerable, helpless, prey. Thomas, driven by a surge of fury and resolve, drove the stake down into Knock's navel with a brutal finality. The old man's body convulsed, his mouth falling open in a final, silent scream, and then he was still. The flames behind him roared louder, leaping from the broken crates to the ancient timbers of the house. Thomas turned and fled, his cane forgotten, his boots pounding against the crumbling floors as the inferno consumed all in its path. As the house collapsed, the melting snow sent plumes of steam and smoke in ghostly spirals to the sky. Ellen stood at the open window of her bedroom, her gaze fixed upon the distant flickering flames of Blackwood Manor. She stood as though bracing herself for something inevitable, something that had waited too long and was now drawing near. From somewhere far below, she heard the slow, deliberate echo of footsteps, each one marking time in the stillness of the house. Orlok's shadow crept up the moonlit staircase, the floorboards groaning underfoot, his breathing growing louder and louder. Ellen remained perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat, her every sense consumed by the approach of that which she could not deny. Trembling, she turned toward the door, as if that single act could offer some escape. But there was no escaping now. She held her arms out, her breath coming in sharp, jagged gasps. And then, he was there, silent, looming. His cold eyes met hers, a communion neither of them had sought, but which had, perhaps, been fated from the very beginning. A single tear fell from Ellen's eye, tracing down her cheek. Too faint to be read, too heavy to be ignored. Was it sorrow? It didn't matter now. The shadow had come for her, and she was wearing her wedding dress. They embraced, the air thick with something unspoken, and Ellen was lifted by him, his grip a force beyond her own. It was violent and frightening, and yet she was drawn to it. Fear gripped her heart, but he only tightened his hold. His lips were cold and moist, and as they touched hers, his mouth stained with remnants of past horrors, she was unable to resist. The kiss, deep, dark, consuming, began to soothe her. The fear, the hesitation, all seemed to melt away into something far more primal, far more intoxicating. It was ecstasy. It was passion. She had never known what it meant to truly feel alive until now. She breathed him in, the scent of him, decay, death, and the faint sweetness of blood filling her senses. A drop of blood fell from her chin, and Orlok's grotesque, rat-like mouth twisted into a grin, revealing the sharp, yellowed teeth beneath. He lifted his head, and in that same fluid motion, he sank his teeth deep into her breast, the sharp pain of the bite jolting through her. She gasped. Her body trembled. The shock of the penetration, both physical and something deeper, something unnameable. Her hands moved of their own accord, gripping his cold, dead skull, pulling him closer. The blood surged through her veins, her heart pulsing erratically, throbbing even, as he drank. Each pull was like a rapture and a symphony of horror. She held him tighter, feeling his breathing. Breathing. Through the open window, Ellen gazed out upon the amber sky, the first light of dawn creeping over the rooftops, spilling across the gables in a soft, golden glow. Orlok's jaws remained locked to Ellen's breast, his grotesque form bloated and swollen with the blood he'd taken. Yet, he was not satisfied. The pull of the dawn, the pull of the end, gnawed at him, and he began to rise, his cold body reluctantly detaching from her. But Ellen, with hands soft and warm, guided him back to her, and he could not resist. He fell back into her embrace, his teeth sinking once more, greedily drinking. The sun crept across the floor, slow but inevitable. Orlok felt his body recoil instinctively. He tried to rise, but it was too late. The sunlight raked over him, slashing at his form, burning, blistering. He raised his hands to shield himself, but the light pierced through him like an executioner's blade. His body contorted violently as the blood he had taken from Ellen poured from his eyes, his mouth, his ears, oozing in thick streams that stained his skin as his screams shredded his very lungs and throat until the very fabric of his existence began to tear apart. The vampire was dying. The sun was destroying him, and yet, as he writhed in his death throes, he could not pull himself away. At last, Thomas rushed into the room, his breath stolen by the horror that greeted him. The two of them twisted together in a grotesque and anguished ballet, their bodies locked in a desperate, suffocating embrace. The horror of it was too much to bear, and he gasped, stepping back, overcome by repulsion and sorrow. Orlok's contorted form shuddered violently, his decayed features dissolving under the weight of the sunlight, while Ellen, impossibly calm, remained in his grasp. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but the light, so bright, continued to stream in as the sun rose higher. Thomas wept openly beside the bed, his face buried in his hands, his sobs soft but endless. The light from the windows bathed him in its golden glow, and never had light seemed so pure, so harmonious, as if the heavens themselves were witnessing the end of a long and terrible night. He gathered more lilacs from the Blackwood property, the flowers fresh and fragrant, and placed them gently on the bed, on the twisted figures of Ellen and the vampire. Orlok was no longer afraid of the daylight that had once threatened to destroy him, and Ellen was no longer so terrified and trembling. Her face, though lifeless, was serene. At last, she was fulfilled, and in the light of the sun, in the purity of the dawn, she was finally at peace.